Rancher abandons sick Mustang in the mountains, doesn't realize who he's messing with. The wind whipped through the Montana mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the distant rumble of thunder. Champ, a magnificent Mustang stallion with a coat the color of burnished copper, stood atop a rocky outcrop, his mane flowing in the wind like a banner. His nostrils flared, testing the air for danger. His eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the vast expanse of wilderness that was his domain. He was a king in his own right, a symbol of wild freedom and untamed spirit. Miles away, in a small, weather-beaten ranch nestled in a valley, Jedediah Thompson, a man as rugged and weathered as the land he worked, surveyed his herd with a growing sense of dread. The cattle, usually boisterous and full of life, were listless, their heads hung low, their coughs echoing through the stillness of the morning. A mysterious illness had swept through the herd, and despite Jedediah's best efforts, the animals were weakening with each passing day. Jedediah was a man of few words, a solitary figure who had spent a lifetime wrestling a living from the unforgiving land. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles etched by the sun and wind, his hands gnarled and calloused from years of toil. He had always prided himself on his self-reliance, his ability to face any hardship with grit and determination. But this was different. This was a threat that seemed to mock his years of experience, his deep connection to the land, and his unwavering belief in his own resilience. He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, his heart heavy with a despair he had never known before. The cattle were more than just livestock to him. They were his lifeblood, his legacy, the culmination of generations of hard work and sacrifice. If he lost them, he lost everything. As he watched another calf succumb to the illness, a desperate thought took root in his mind. He had heard tales from old-timers about the wild Mustangs, the descendants of Spanish horses brought to the Americas centuries ago. These horses, they said, possessed a natural hardiness, a resistance to diseases that plagued domestic breeds. Could there be any truth to these stories? Could a wild Mustang hold the key to saving his herd? The idea was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but Jedediah was a man with his back against the wall. He had nothing left to lose. His gaze drifted towards the distant mountains, the realm of the wild horses, a place he had always respected, even revered. Now, it held the faint glimmer of hope, a lifeline in a sea of despair. With a heavy sigh and a newfound resolve in his eyes, Jedediah turned towards the barn, his mind already churning with plans to capture a wild Mustang, a creature as untamed and unpredictable as the storm brewing on the horizon. He knew it would be a dangerous undertaking, a battle of wills against a creature that embodied freedom itself. But he was ready to fight, for his herd, for his livelihood, for his very survival. The rising sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain as Jedediah set out, his old pickup truck groaning under the weight of the makeshift corral he had constructed in the back. His destination was the high country, the domain of the wild Mustangs, a place he had rarely ventured into, preferring the familiar comfort of his valley. But desperation had a way of pushing a man beyond his comfort zone. The journey was arduous, the narrow mountain roads winding through dense forests and steep ravines. Jedediah gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the treacherous path ahead. He couldn't afford any mistakes, not now. The fate of his herd, his livelihood, rested on his success. After hours of driving, he reached the foothills of the mountains, where the landscape opened into rolling meadows dotted with clusters of pine trees. This was Mustang country, a place where the wild horses roamed free, their spirits as untamed as the land itself. Jedediah parked his truck and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel, his senses heightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. He could feel the presence of the horses, their energy vibrating through the very air he breathed. He saw them in the distance, a small band grazing peacefully in a meadow, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. Among them was Champ, his copper coat and proud bearing unmistakable. Even from afar, Jedediah could sense the stallion's power and wildness. Setting up the makeshift corral was a laborious task, the heavy metal panels digging into the soft earth. Jedediah worked with a grim determination, his movements precise and efficient. He knew he had to be quick to catch the horses off guard. He couldn't risk a chase. These were wild creatures, their instincts honed by generations of survival in this unforgiving landscape. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the meadow, Jedediah's trap was set. He retreated to his truck, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and dread churning in his gut. He watched as the horses, led by Champ, cautiously approached the corral, their curiosity piqued by the unfamiliar structure. Jedediah waited, his breath held, his fingers hovering over the lever that would spring the trap. The moment stretched into an eternity, the only sound the gentle clinking of the horses' hooves on the rocky ground. Then, with a sudden surge of movement, Champ stepped into the enclosure, followed by several mares and their foals. Jedediah slammed the lever down, the metal gates clanging shut, trapping the horses inside. The peaceful meadow erupted in chaos, the horses whinnying and snorting, their hooves pounding against the metal bars. Champ, his eyes wild with fear and anger, reared up, his powerful body crashing against the enclosure. Jedediah's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had done it. He had captured the wild stallion, the symbol of freedom, the embodiment of the very spirit he was trying to harness. But as he watched Champ struggle against his confinement, a pang of guilt pierced through his triumph. He had brought this magnificent creature into his world of despair, a world where even the strongest could succumb to the unseen forces of nature. The journey back to the ranch was fraught with tension. Champ, enraged and terrified, fought against his confinement, his powerful hooves threatening to break through the flimsy walls of the corral. Jedediah drove slowly, his hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had taken a gamble, a desperate measure to save his herd. But at what cost? As the truck rumbled down the mountain road, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape, Jedediah couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, that he had disturbed a delicate balance, and that the consequences of his actions would be far-reaching and unpredictable. The ranch, usually a haven of peace and quiet, was now filled with the unsettling sounds of Champ's distress. His frantic whinnies echoed through the night, a stark contrast to the mournful lowing of the sick cattle. Jedediah, unable to sleep, paced the porch of his house, the creaking floorboards a rhythmic counterpoint to the cacophony outside. He had hoped that bringing Champ to the ranch would somehow provide a solution, a spark of hope in the face of despair. But the reality was far more grim. The wild stallion, weakened by the journey and the stress of captivity, had succumbed to the same illness that was ravaging his herd. Champ lay in the makeshift corral, his once vibrant coat now dull and lifeless, his breathing labored, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored Jedediah's own. Days turned into weeks, and the situation only worsened. The cattle continued to die, their carcasses littering the fields, a grim testament to Jedediah's failing struggle. Champ, though still alive, was a shadow of his former self, his spirit broken, his wildness replaced by a weary resignation. Jedediah found himself trapped in a cycle of despair. He spent his days tending to the sick animals, administering what little medicine he had, burying the dead. His nights haunted by the sounds of suffering and the weight of his own helplessness. The hope that had driven him to capture Champ had dwindled into a bitter regret. He had brought this magnificent creature into his world of suffering, only to watch him fade away. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate ranch, Jedediah made a decision. It was a decision born out of desperation, a desperate attempt to salvage what little he had left. He would take Champ back to the mountains, back to the wilderness where he belonged, and leave him there. It was a cruel act, a betrayal of the trust he had inadvertently earned during Champ's captivity. But Jedediah convinced himself it was the only way. He hitched his truck to the trailer, the metal groaning under the weight of the weakened stallion. Champ offered no resistance as Jedediah loaded him, his eyes dull and lifeless. The journey back to the mountains was a somber one, the silence broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional cough from the horse in the trailer. Jedediah drove deep into the wilderness, far beyond the familiar trails, until he reached a secluded clearing. He unhitched the trailer and led Champ out, the stallion stumbling on his weakened legs. With a heavy heart, Jedediah chained the horse to a sturdy tree, the metal links a cruel symbol of his own desperation. He left a small pile of hay and a bucket of water, a meager offering of comfort, then turned and walked away. The image of Champ's resigned eyes burned into his memory. As he drove away, the sound of Champ's weak whinnies echoing through the trees, Jedediah felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had abandoned the wild stallion, leaving him to the mercy of the elements, to the predators that roamed the mountains. He had become the very thing he had always despised, a man who turned his back on a creature in need. The weight of his actions settled on his shoulders like a heavy burden, a burden he would carry with him for the rest of his days. He had made a choice, a desperate choice, but a choice that had cost him his peace of mind, his sense of self-worth. He had traded his humanity for a slim chance of survival, and in doing so, he had lost a part of himself he could never regain. The forest pressed in on Champ, a suffocating wall of green and brown. The chain bit into his flesh, a constant reminder of his captivity, his helplessness. He strained against it, his weakened muscles protesting, the metal links digging deeper into his skin. But it was no use. He was trapped, tethered to this lonely spot, left to the mercy of the elements, the predators, the gnawing hunger that consumed him. The illness ravaged his body, stealing his strength, his spirit. His once proud head hung low, his magnificent copper coat now matted and dull. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the pain that racked his lungs. He shivered in the cold mountain air, his body weakened by fever, his legs trembling beneath him. He tried to graze on the sparse grass around him, but his appetite was gone, replaced by a nausea that churned his stomach. The water in the bucket, left by the man who had abandoned him, was stale and tepid, but he drank it anyway, his thirst overpowering his disgust. The days blurred into an endless cycle of pain, hunger, and fear. The sun beat down on him mercilessly, the rain soaked him to the bone, the wind chilled him to the core. He longed for the freedom of the open plains, the companionship of his herd, the taste of fresh grass, the feel of the wind in his mane. But all that was gone, replaced by this desolate prison, this slow, agonizing death. He watched the forest creatures with wary eyes, the squirrels scampering up the trees, the deer grazing in the distance, the birds flitting through the branches. They were free, untouched by the illness that consumed him, their movements a constant reminder of his own captivity. At night, the forest came alive with sounds that sent shivers down his spine. The hooting of owls, the howling of wolves, the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. He strained his ears, his heart pounding in his chest, his nostrils filled with the scent of danger. He was vulnerable, exposed, a feast waiting to happen. One night, a pair of glowing eyes pierced the darkness, their predatory gaze fixed on him. A mountain lion, sleek and powerful, emerged from the shadows, its muscles rippling beneath its tawny coat. It circled him slowly, its low growl a chilling prelude to the attack. Champ braced himself, his instincts screaming at him to flee, to fight. But his body was too weak, his spirit broken. He could only watch in terror as the lion crept closer, its fangs bared, its eyes gleaming with hunger. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable, the final blow that would end his suffering. But it never came. Instead, he heard a commotion, a flurry of movement, a series of snarls and growls that echoed through the night. He opened his eyes to see the lion locked in a fierce battle with another creature, a large, shaggy wolf, its fur the color of the moonlit forest. The two predators fought with a ferocity that made Champ's blood run cold, their teeth and claws flashing in the darkness. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity, the air filled with the sounds of snarls, growls, and the sickening thud of flesh against flesh. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The wolf lay dead on the ground, its body ripped and torn, its blood staining the forest floor. The lion, victorious but wounded, limped away into the shadows, leaving Champ alone once more. He watched the scene with a mixture of awe and horror, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been spared, but at what cost? The wolf, a creature of the wild like himself, had sacrificed its life to protect him. He didn't understand why, but he felt a deep sense of gratitude, a connection to this creature he had never known. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the trees, casting a pale light on the forest floor, Champ lay exhausted and trembling, the events of the night replaying in his mind. He was still alive, but he knew his time was running out. He was alone, weak, and vulnerable, a prisoner in his own body, a captive of his own fate. But even in his despair, a spark of hope remained. The wolf's sacrifice had shown him that even in the darkest of times, kindness and compassion could exist. It was a small comfort, a fleeting moment of light in the overwhelming darkness, but it was enough to keep him clinging to life, to the faint hope that someone, might come to his rescue. Lily, a young woman with a spirit as wild as the mountains she loved, hiked through the forest with a lightness in her step that belied the weight of her backpack. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees, dappling the forest floor with patches of light and shadow. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Lily was a creature of the wilderness, more at home in the company of trees and animals than among her fellow humans. She had a deep connection to nature, an innate understanding of its rhythms and secrets. She spent her days exploring the mountains, her camera her constant companion, capturing the beauty of the natural world, documenting its wonders. She had always been drawn to the wild horses, their untamed spirit resonating with her own. She had seen them from afar, their silhouettes against the skyline, their manes flowing in the wind. But she had never dared to approach them, respecting their wildness, their need for freedom. On this day, however, her path led her to a secluded clearing, a place she had never been before. As she stepped into the clearing, her heart skipped a beat. There, tethered to a tree, stood a magnificent stallion, his copper coat gleaming in the sunlight. But something was wrong. The horse was emaciated. His head hung low, his eyes dull and lifeless. Lily's heart ached at the sight of the suffering animal. She approached cautiously, her footsteps barely disturbing the forest floor. As she drew closer, she saw the chain that bound him, the cruel metal links digging into his flesh. She saw the fear in his eyes, the resignation in his posture. She knelt beside him, her hand outstretched, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm here to help." The horse flinched at her touch, his body trembling, his eyes wide with apprehension. But Lily persisted, her gentle touch calming his fear, her soothing words easing his anxiety. She examined his wounds, the chafing from the chain, the signs of illness that ravaged his body. A wave of anger washed over her. Who could do this to such a magnificent creature? Who could abandon him to such a fate? She vowed to help him, to free him from his chains, to nurse him back to health. She rummaged through her backpack, pulling out her first aid kit, her water bottle, her granola bars. She cleaned his wounds, offered him water, and coaxed him to eat. He was hesitant at first, his body weak, his spirit broken. But Lily's persistence, her unwavering kindness, slowly began to chip away at his defenses. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Lily knew she couldn't stay. She had to return to her cabin, to her family, to the world outside this secluded haven. But she couldn't leave the horse alone, not in this condition. She made a decision. She would return tomorrow with supplies, with help. She would free him from his chains. She would heal him. She would give him back his freedom. She gave him one last pat, a silent promise of her return, then turned and walked away, her heart heavy with the weight of the task ahead, but her spirit lifted by the glimmer of hope she had found in the eyes of the abandoned stallion. The night was long for Lily. Sleep evaded her, her mind filled with the image of the suffering stallion. She tossed and turned, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility, the urge to act, to help. Dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Lily rose with a renewed sense of purpose. She packed her backpack with supplies: fresh water, apples, carrots, bandages, antiseptic, and a pair of bolt cutters. She hesitated, then added a warm blanket and a sturdy rope. The hike back to the clearing felt longer this time, each step laden with anticipation and a touch of fear. What if the horse was gone? What if he was worse? What if she couldn't help him? But as she entered the clearing, her anxieties melted away. The stallion was still there, his head lifted slightly, his ears pricked at the sound of her approach. He seemed to recognize her, a flicker of hope in his dull eyes. Lily approached slowly, speaking softly, reassuring him with her voice and gentle touch. She offered him water and apples, which he accepted hesitantly, his movements stiff and labored. Then, with a deep breath, she took out the bolt cutters. The steel jaws snapped through the chain with a satisfying clang, freeing the stallion from his physical bonds. He stood for a moment, unsure of what to do, his legs trembling, his body swaying. Lily gently slipped the rope around his neck, not as a restraint, but as a guide, a lifeline. "Come on, fella," she coaxed. "Let's get you out of here." He followed her hesitantly, his steps faltering at first, then growing steadier as he gained confidence. They moved slowly, Lily matching her pace to his, guiding him through the undergrowth, towards her cabin, towards safety. The journey was arduous, the terrain rough and uneven. The stallion stumbled often, his weakened body struggling to keep up. But Lily never gave up, her determination fueled by compassion, her strength drawn from the bond she felt with the animal. As they neared her cabin, a small, rustic structure nestled in a secluded valley, Lily felt a surge of relief. She had made it. She had brought him home. But her challenges were far from over. She had to tend to his wounds, nurse him back to health, and face the consequences of her actions. She knew her family wouldn't approve, the local ranchers would be furious, and the authorities might even get involved. But as she looked at the stallion, now resting comfortably in her barn, his breathing steady, his eyes filled with a newfound trust, she knew she had done the right thing. She had listened to her heart, she had followed her instincts, and she had saved a life. The weight of compassion was heavy, but it was a burden she carried willingly, a burden that filled her with a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection to the wild spirit she had found in the heart of the mountains. The valley where Lily lived was a tight-knit community, a patchwork of small farms and ranches connected by winding dirt roads and shared histories. News traveled fast, carried on the wind, whispered over fences, shared over steaming mugs of coffee at the general store. It wasn't long before word of Lily's rescue reached the ears of her family and neighbors. Her father, a gruff but loving man weathered by years of hard work on their small farm, was the first to confront her. He stood in the doorway of the barn, his brow furrowed, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and disapproval. "Lily, what in tarnation have you done?" he asked, his voice rough but laced with worry. "That's a wild Mustang, girl. It ain't no pet. It belongs in the mountains, not here." Lily, her hands busy tending to the stallion's wounds, met her father's gaze with a defiant spark in her eyes. "He was dying, Pa," she said, her voice firm. "Someone left him chained to a tree, sick and abandoned. I couldn't just leave him there." Her father sighed, running a calloused hand through his thinning gray hair. "I know you got a good heart, Lily," he said, "but this ain't the way to go about things. That horse is dangerous. He could hurt you, hurt the livestock. And what about the law? You know it's illegal to keep a wild horse." Lily's shoulders slumped, the weight of her actions settling upon her. She knew her father was right, but she couldn't bring herself to regret what she had done. "I'll figure it out, Pa," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll find a way to make things right." Her father, seeing the determination in her eyes, softened his tone. "All right, Lily," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out together. But you gotta be careful. This ain't no game. That horse is wild, and he ain't gonna forget what's been done to him." The news of the wild Mustang spread like wildfire through the valley. Some were curious, others were skeptical, and a few were downright hostile. Old Man Hemmings, a cantankerous rancher who had lost several calves to predators, was particularly vocal in his disapproval. "That girl's gone and done lost her mind," he grumbled to anyone who would listen. "Bringing that wild beast down here, it's just asking for trouble. Mark my words, it'll be the ruin of us all." Lily tried to ignore the whispers and the disapproving glances, but they weighed on her, adding to the burden she already carried. She spent her days caring for the stallion, cleaning his wounds, feeding him, talking to him in soothing tones. She named him Spirit, a tribute to his indomitable will, his wild heart. Spirit, in turn, seemed to respond to her kindness. He allowed her to touch him, to groom him, to lead him around the paddock. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, now held a spark of trust, a glimmer of gratitude. But Lily knew she couldn't keep Spirit hidden forever. She had to find a solution, a way to ensure his safety and well-being, a way to appease the concerns of her community. And she had to do it soon, before the whispers turned into accusations, before the fear turned into anger. The weight of the situation pressed down on Lily. Spirit was recovering, slowly regaining his strength and spirit, but his presence at the farm was a growing concern. The whispers in the valley were getting louder, the disapproval more palpable. Lily knew she had to act, to find a solution that would ensure Spirit's safety and appease the community. One evening, after a long day tending to Spirit and the farm chores, Lily sat at her kitchen table, a worn map of the state spread out before her. Her gaze drifted to the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched across the northern part of the state, a land of mountains and forests, the ancestral home of the wild Mustangs. An idea began to take shape in her mind. What if she could find a sanctuary, a place where Spirit could live in freedom, among his own kind? She knew of a few wild horse sanctuaries in the state, places dedicated to protecting and preserving these magnificent creatures. Perhaps one of them would be willing to take Spirit in. With renewed hope, Lily reached for the phone, her fingers dialing the number of the closest sanctuary. The voice on the other end was warm and welcoming. A woman named Sarah who listened patiently to Lily's story. Sarah expressed her concern for Spirit's well-being and her admiration for Lily's compassion. "It sounds like you've done a wonderful thing, Lily," Sarah said, her voice filled with kindness. "We'd be happy to assess Spirit and see if he's a good fit for our sanctuary. We have a herd of Mustangs here, and we strive to provide them with a safe and natural environment." Lily's heart soared with relief. She had found a solution, a ray of hope for Spirit's future. She arranged to meet Sarah at the sanctuary the following week, a journey that filled her with both excitement and trepidation. The news of Lily's plans spread through the valley, bringing a mixed reaction. Some were relieved, seeing it as a solution to a growing problem. Others were skeptical, doubting that a wild horse could ever be truly safe in a sanctuary. And a few, like Old Man Hemmings, remained stubbornly opposed. "That horse is trouble, I tell ya," he grumbled at the general store. "Sending him to some fancy sanctuary ain't gonna change that. He'll be back, mark my words, and he'll bring a whole herd of wild horses with him." Lily tried to ignore the negativity, focusing on the positive. She spent the next few days preparing Spirit for the journey, grooming him, talking to him, reassuring him. She also reached out to a local veterinarian, Dr. Miller, a kind and compassionate woman who had always been supportive of Lily's love for animals. Dr. Miller agreed to examine Spirit and provide him with any necessary vaccinations and health certificates before his trip to the sanctuary. She arrived at the farm with a smile and a gentle touch, calming Spirit's anxieties with her reassuring presence. "He's a beautiful animal, Lily," Dr. Miller said, stroking Spirit's mane. "You've done a wonderful job caring for him. He's strong and healthy, and I'm sure he'll thrive in the sanctuary." Lily's heart swelled with gratitude. She had found allies in her quest to help Spirit, people who shared her compassion, her belief in the importance of protecting these magnificent creatures. The whispers in the valley still lingered, but they were now overshadowed by a growing wave of support, a ripple of change that started with one girl's act of kindness. The day of the journey to the sanctuary dawned bright and clear, the sky a canvas of endless blue. Lily woke with a mix of emotions swirling within her. Excitement, anticipation, and a touch of sadness at the thought of parting with Spirit. She had grown attached to the stallion, their bond forged through shared hardship and unwavering trust. After a final grooming and a heartfelt goodbye, Lily and her father loaded Spirit into the horse trailer. Dr. Miller had already visited, giving Spirit a clean bill of health and the necessary paperwork for his relocation. As they set off, Lily couldn't help but glance back at the receding farm, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. The drive to the sanctuary was long, winding through scenic mountain roads and vast stretches of open plains. Lily sat beside her father, her gaze alternating between the passing landscape and the occasional glimpse of Spirit in the rearview mirror. The stallion seemed calm, his head lowered, his eyes half closed, perhaps reminiscing about the freedom he once knew. As they neared the sanctuary, Lily's anticipation grew. She had seen pictures online, but nothing could prepare her for the sight that greeted them as they drove through the gates. Rolling hills, dotted with trees and sparkling streams, stretched as far as the eye could see. A herd of Mustangs grazed peacefully in the distance, their coats gleaming in the sunlight, their manes flowing in the gentle breeze. Sarah, the sanctuary manager, welcomed them with a warm smile and a gentle demeanor. She led them to a spacious paddock, where Spirit would be introduced to the herd gradually. As they unloaded the stallion, Lily's heart ached with a mix of sadness and joy. She knew this was the best place for him, a place where he could roam free, among his own kind. As Spirit stepped into the paddock, his ears pricked, his nostrils flared, sensing the presence of other horses. He let out a loud whinny, a call that echoed across the hills, answered by a chorus of whinnies from the distant herd. A few curious Maras approached, their eyes wide with interest, their tails swishing gently. Lily watched as Spirit interacted with the other horses, his initial nervousness giving way to cautious curiosity. He was home, in a place where he belonged, surrounded by the sights and sounds of his wild heritage. Later that day, as Lily and her father prepared to leave, Sarah took them aside, her expression grave. "Lily," she began, "I need to tell you something about Spirit. We examined him thoroughly when he arrived, and we discovered something disturbing." Lily's heart sank. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He has a brand," Sarah said, her voice low. "A brand that belongs to a rancher named Jedediah Thompson." Lily's blood ran cold. Jedediah Thompson. The name echoed in her mind, bringing back the memory of the chained horse, the abandoned stallion, the cruel act of desperation. It all made sense now. Jedediah, the man she had never met, the man whose actions had brought so much pain and suffering, was the one who had abandoned Spirit. A wave of anger washed over her, mixed with a deep sense of betrayal. She had risked everything to save Spirit, and now she discovered that the person who had caused his suffering was someone she knew, someone from her own community. As they drove back to the valley, the landscape seemed different, the familiar sights now tainted by the revelation. Lily's heart was heavy, her thoughts consumed by the injustice, the cruelty, the betrayal. She had found a home for Spirit, but she had also uncovered a dark secret, a truth that would forever change her perception of her community, her world. The silence in the truck was thick with unspoken words, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. Lily's father, sensing her turmoil, reached out and squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of support. He too was grappling with the news, his mind replaying the years of shared meals and casual conversations with Jedediah, now tainted with the knowledge of the rancher's desperate act. Lily's anger simmered, fueled by a sense of injustice and betrayal. How could Jedediah, a man they knew, a man who shared their community, have inflicted such cruelty on a defenseless creature? She felt a surge of protectiveness towards Spirit, a fierce determination to ensure his safety and well-being, now more than ever. As they pulled into the farm, Lily couldn't wait any longer. She jumped out of the truck, her footsteps determined as she marched towards Jedediah's ranch. Her father followed close behind, his expression a mix of concern and apprehension. Jedediah was mending a fence when Lily stormed into his yard, her eyes blazing with anger. "You!" she spat, her voice shaking with emotion. "You did this to him. You left him to die." Jedediah looked up, startled by the intrusion and the accusation in Lily's voice. He recognized her as the Thompson girl, the one who always had her nose in a book or her camera pointed at some wild creature. He had never spoken to her directly, but he knew of her love for animals, her gentle spirit. "What are you talking about, girl?" he asked, his voice gruff, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Spirit," Lily cried, her voice cracking. "The Mustang. You chained him in the forest. Left him for the bears. How could you?" The color drained from Jedediah's face, his eyes widening in recognition. He remembered the desperate act, the agonizing decision he had made in a moment of despair. He had tried to bury the memory, to push it to the back of his mind, but now it was staring him in the face, embodied in the anger of this young woman. I didn't have a choice," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "My herd was dying. I was desperate." "Desperate?" Lily retorted, her voice filled with scorn. "Is that what you call cruelty? Is that what you call abandoning a helpless creature to suffer and die?" Jedediah's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions crushing him. He had no excuses, no justifications. He had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice heavy with regret. "I truly am. I never meant for him to suffer." Lily's anger softened, replaced by a wave of pity. She saw the pain in his eyes, the remorse in his posture. She realized that Jedediah, despite his harsh exterior, was a man broken by hardship, a man who had made a terrible choice in a moment of desperation. "I know you're sorry," she said, her voice calmer now. "But sorry isn't enough. You need to make amends. You need to help Spirit." Jedediah looked up, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. "How?" he asked, his voice earnest. Lily explained about the sanctuary, about Spirit's new home, about the need for ongoing support and care. Jedediah listened intently, his expression shifting from despair to determination. "I'll help," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." And he did. Jedediah became a regular visitor at the sanctuary, donating his time and resources to ensure Spirit's well-being. He learned about wild horse conservation, about the importance of preserving their habitat and protecting their freedom. He even started volunteering at the sanctuary, helping with the daily chores, caring for the horses, sharing his knowledge of the land and its creatures. Lily, witnessing Jedediah's transformation, felt a sense of peace and forgiveness. She saw the good in him, the remorse that had led him to redemption. She realized that even in the darkest of hearts, there was always a possibility for change, for growth, for healing. The valley, once filled with whispers and worries, now buzzed with a different kind of story, a story of compassion, forgiveness, and a shared commitment to protecting the wild spirit that roamed their mountains. Lily, Jedediah, and Spirit, each in their own way, had become symbols of hope, reminders that even in the face of adversity, kindness and understanding could prevail. And as the sun set over the valley, casting long shadows across the land, a sense of peace settled over the community, a peace born from the knowledge that they had learned from their mistakes, that they had found a way to coexist with the wild, to respect its power and cherish its beauty.